Today is Good Shepherd Sunday, the fourth Sunday in Easter. Every year we read about Jesus, the Good Shepherd. And I find sheep very amusing, especially since I've never had to take care of them. And I think it's even more amusing that Jesus, who made both sheep and us, compares us to them. And my favorite story is from my friend's dad. And I just happened to see him on Friday, and I asked him about this. And they decided to go into the sheep raising business, and the sheep arrived on a trailer that had 3 decks on it. And he told me that there were 600 feeder lambs on that trailer. And they backed it up, and they got everything ready, and then they opened the gate, and they expected the sheep to just flood out, which they didn't do. And they asked the driver, said, "How do you get the sheep out?" He didn't know. He usually was used to hauling hogs. And so they climbed in there and pulled them out one by one. And this was a long and exhausting task, and they had to crawl through a lot of you-know-what. And every time they got into the trailer, the sheep would run to the front, and it took a long time. So later, he found someone that had raised sheep, and he says, "What do you do? What's the secret?" And he said, "Well, all you do is you go and you take 2 or 3 of them out, and then you go get a cup of coffee, and they all follow the leader and unload themselves." For sheep, they really need shepherds to take care of them. As one person that took care of sheep said, they kind of have a patent on stupidity. And the shepherd is everything for his flock. Their life, their sustenance, and their care is entirely in his hands. And if the shepherd is good, then the sheep will have nothing to fear, and they will want for nothing. On the other hand, if the flock is watched by a hired man, they have much to fear. In a time of tranquility, all is good. But when danger arrives, the hired man flees, since he loves himself more than the sheep. But fortunately for us, even though we are sheep, Jesus is the good shepherd of our souls. He is the shepherd of the little flock of his church. And he is this for 3 reasons. First, because he paid for it dearly. Second, because he guards it carefully. And third, because he feeds it abundantly. St. Peter, in his defense before the Sanhedrin, announces with great force and deep assurance that Jesus Christ was crucified and raised to become the only source of salvation for the human race. Jesus freely laid down his life for the flock, purchasing us at a great price, namely the price of his own blood. And in this, we see that God's love that he gives to us, not only has he spoken about his love again and again, he has also proved it in concrete deeds. So in truth, Jesus could say to each one of us, "What more could I do that I haven't already done? What more could I have done that I have not already done?" The Good Shepherd has given everything to purchase the little flock. And because he loves us so dearly, Jesus guards his sheep with care from all that could bring them harm. In the text, Jesus refers to 2 dangers to sheep, thieves and wolves. Both threaten the helpless and defenseless sheep. Thieves steal and wolves kill. And if we interpret this spiritually, we understand that thieves are false prophets, heretics, and deceptive leaders who take the faithful away from the true sheepfold of Christ. And they are not sent by God, and they do not have permission to change the teaching of the gospel. And when they do this, they wreak havoc, and they divide the one flock of Christ. Likewise, wolves are symbols of spiritual enemies who try to lay waste to the flock. As St. Paul said, we are not contending against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers and the world rulers of this present darkness. So to safeguard the sheep, St. Vincent Ferrer says, Christ makes use of dogs. which keep watch night and day and hunt down the wolves of hell. And this was and is a very common means of defense. We hear about it even in the Old Testament. Job speaks about dogs guarding his flocks, as does the prophet Isaiah. So St. Vincent interprets the dogs as those who have the office of preaching in the church. He says, demons are more afraid of and are more terrified by the clamor and barking of preaching than wolves are of the barking of dogs. So preachers exercise this role on behalf of the Good Shepherd as he provides for his flock. Today, though, those of us who have been given the task of preaching often fail to preach the gospel in its entirety and sometimes fall silent when we should speak. The dogs entrusted with guarding the flock of Christ sometimes are quiet and run away. And I say this with a heavy heart because I am implicated in this as much as the next guy, and we all have a lot to work on. We know that much of the Catholic faith is accepted with gladness, and these things are easy to speak about, while other parts are ignored and rejected. And there are many of those, but some of them include the teaching that salvation comes from Jesus alone through his church, the reality and eternity of hell, certain moral issues, including particular those relating to the 6th and 9th commandments, and many other teachings. To speak about these things means rowing against the prevailing current, which is never easy. And we fail to do this for several reasons: cowardice, greed, false humility, a love of comfort, a desire for honors, a lack of faith, a lack of hope, a lack of love, our own sins, as well as many other things, I'm sure. And it is also not easy to hear about these things, especially if they require us to change our minds or to convert our hearts or to turn away from sin. But what we should all do, whether we preach or not, is to listen for the voice of the Good Shepherd calling us to life in abundance and warning us against threats to our spiritual good. He invites us to fight the enemies of our salvation with the assurance that goodness and truth will always triumph over evil and falsehood. We are more than conquerors, St. Paul says, through Christ Jesus who loved us. Finally, the goodness of Jesus the shepherd is shown in this, that he feeds the sheep generously, namely in the sacrament of the altar, the Holy Eucharist. And we know that sheep generally graze on the field. Sometimes they're offered something else. But how impressive would it be if the shepherd invited the sheep to eat from his own garden, or if he took them into his home and fed them from his own table? But Jesus does even more than this for his sheep. He permits us to eat in his house, the church, and to feed at his table, the altar, where he provides not bread, but his body as food and his blood as drink. And this is not even something that we have imagined a shepherd doing, feeding the flock with his own blood. The Eucharist is a true bread from heaven, endowed with all delights and suited to every taste. And when received properly, Holy Communion gives health and peace to the soul and works to transform us into the likeness of Jesus Christ. So the Good Shepherd acquired his flock at a great cost. He guards it carefully and he feeds it abundantly. May we, the sheep of his fold, continue always to follow him until we reach the eternal pastures of heaven.